So, Michael, let's start when we are talking about Equifax. What is Equifax for those people who may not know? And if there's anybody out there, I should say, if they don't know what Equifax is, they should, because Equifax certainly knows about them.
That's right, Sam. Equifax is one of the three main credit reporting bureaus in the United States. So when you have, you go to buy a car or a house and they run your credit report, it's one of the companies that maintains and compiles credit reporting data. And what the scary part about what we're talking about with Equifax is even if you don't do business with Equifax, you've done business with Equifax. They have private information. They have information about your accounts and about pretty much everyone.
How is it? How do they? Under what auspices can they collect that information if you haven't given it to them, or have you given it to them and you just didn't realize it?
Well, in a way, it's aggregated information, so it's collected information, and part of it is that you've given it to them, part of it's that you've requested, and part of it that's what they've been tasked with doing is collecting that credit information to make basically the financial decisions upon.
Okay, and so Equifax is one of these three companies that has this information. How tightly regulated? I mean, and I want to get obviously to the breach, but people should have just sort of a broad understanding of what these companies do. How tightly regulated is their algorithm or their computation, right? I mean, they come out with a number anywhere from, 400 to 750 or 800 that makes it possible for you to get loans at a cheaper amount and whatnot. How do they go about creating this algorithm, which is, it seems to me, somewhat subjective, right? And in many cases, I would imagine, not necessarily totally fair.
Right, and I think you're correct in that regard. And each of the companies, whether it's Experian or Equifax or one of the other ones, they have a slightly different formula, and that's why when you see a report, it comes out with different numbers. And part of that's just they weight things differently. For the most part, I believe the formula in general terms is relatively uniform. They're looking at the same types of things, the types of accounts you open, how long they've been open, and I think it's just weighted differently by company. And I'm not sure there's a lot of rhyme or reason to it. I think you're correct. Is that a lot of times it's not reflective of anything in actual credit quality, but nevertheless, it's what's widely used among the financial companies, banks, and credit unions, et cetera.
And if you've been irresponsible with your credit in some way, right? I guess that could range from, you forgot too many bills, and you lost the cable bill for 3 or 4 months, and they had to notify a collection agency. It's a strike against you on your credit report. What obligations do they have in terms of acting responsibly?
Sure, on a very basic level, they have the same type of obligation anyone else would have, which is that you got to at least act reasonably. I mean, that's a simple baseline, but I think particularly because of the type of data they have, the type of data they know they have, which includes not just Social Security numbers, not just information about your date of birth and your name, but this literally gets into credit-specific information, like credit cards, like what banks you use, like what kind of loans you have. So I think because of the type of information you're dealing with, which is more than just name and Social Security number, this is sort of the Pandora's box. I mean, these guys hold the key to probably your personal financial kingdom, and that if somebody gets access to that, they could potentially be looking at credit cards, they could be looking at loans, banks, and have all of your personal financial information, Social Security number, date of birth, everything that a good hacker would need to be able to use and abuse somebody's personal financial information. I think these guys have it.
So, I mean, so you say that they're bound by a standard of reasonable care, right? And that's a fairly generic standard. What sets that standard? Is it like the UCC or some other like broad commercial law? What sets even just the reasonable standard before we go on to talk about what constitutes reasonable in this instance?
And I actually think I would even take it a little bit further. I sort of set the reasonable standard as a baseline, but I think these guys are sort of in a special relationship with consumers, with the people whose information they hold, because it's not just their name, and it's not just a patient's records or a customer's records. I mean, you're talking about very sensitive data. So I think it's a heightened standard, and you can look to a few different places. This can come from regulation. Certainly that's one aspect, but I don't even think you need to get bogged down there. I mean, this is just basic entry-level legal stuff, where we're talking about what kind of information are you dealing with, what kind of relationship do you have, and they're clearly in a superior position over the consumer. The consumer doesn't control their credit. I mean, if you want to go dispute something that's on your credit report, good luck. I mean, you could spend years doing that, and it could be something it's false, and I think this has been documented by some other people in the past, where you might have somebody by the same name. So if you have a Michael Bixby, and maybe there's another Michael Bixby who's really irresponsible with his credit card, and that information could actually get reported on my credit report. And it's just very, very difficult. So the type of information that you're dealing with is so sensitive that it's a heightened standard, I think, just for a normal consumer.
I mean, I agree with that. I mean, it sounds reasonable to me that there would be a heightened standard. But for those of us who are not lawyers and who don't know about the sort of entry-level legal obligations, like, where does that come from? I mean, why can't Equifax just say, like, well, look, we collect this stuff, but, you gave it to us, or you gave it to somebody who gave it to us. Where does the obligation for them to in other words, this is not like me going to a bank, right, and paying $20 a month for a safety deposit box with, I don't know, my will and the deed to my house, or the title to my car, and putting it in the safety deposit box, right? And because once I give them money, there's at the very least an implicit contract that I'm giving it to them to take care of this stuff. But have I ever made a contract with Equifax? I don't know if I have, but I mean, did that contract obligate them to treat it with care? Where does that obligation come from legally?
Sure. And so you've identified one area that it can. Sure, it can be contractual. And that's one thing. But I think there's a lot of the 146 million or however many people have been exposed by this that won't necessarily have that business relationship with Equifax that you've identified. And if that's the case, beyond the regulations, which I think that there are some specific regulations that will apply to this, and that will say that you have to handle your data with certain precautions. And we don't know the full extent of exactly what Equifax did at this point. We don't have all that inside information. That's part of what's going to come out over the next few months and over the next couple of years. But basically, under the law, under common law, that reasonableness standard is going to be defined typically under state common law, but it shares a lot of similarities whatever state you might be in. But that comes back, basically is developed over hundreds of years, and that's the whole reasonable person standard. And you're going to see where I believe, and I think they should be held to that heightened standard because of the type of information they had. It's not just act as a reasonable person, but they needed to act as a reasonable company who knew what kind of very, very sensitive information they held, financial information they held.
All right. Well, Michael, you've laid out to us what Equifax does, what their responsibility is to the average consumer. And when we come back, we'll talk about why they may have breached that responsibility and the scope of it, because I don't think anybody listening to this program is unaffected by this. And then we'll talk about what should people be doing at this point. There's been a lot of conflicting information about signing up on their website and their forced arbitration clause, and maybe they've rescinded that. They've certainly created a tremendous amount of confusion as well as a tremendous amount of anxiety. We got to take a quick break. When we come back, Michael, you'll help us sort that out. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.